Welcome back, everyone. Before I introduce our speaker this evening, I did want to say a little bit about the availability of recordings of the presentations from the conference. Recordings will become available, but this may take a few days as there is some work involved in getting them set up. Registrants for the conference will receive an email as soon as that's ready and giving you a link to the site where the recordings will be available. I'm very pleased to introduce our keynote speaker tonight, Dr. Morgan Tingley. Morgan is a professor in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at the University of California, Los Angeles, having previously held academic positions at the University of Connecticut and Princeton University. He holds a PhD in environmental science, policy, and management from the University of California, Berkeley. Prior to that, he received his BA from Harvard University and his master's degree from Oxford University. He's a fellow of the American Ornithological Society, with whom he currently serves as an elected counselor. He's published many papers on the ecology of birds in California, and I'm sure many of you, like I, have seen reference to his work in newspapers like the LA Times, the Washington Post, and so on, especially with the strong interest that we all have in fire and its ecology in the West nowadays. Tonight, he'll be speaking to us on the topic of the changing nature of fire and its impact on California birds. Dr. Tingley.
Thank you, John, and thank you all for joining in on this Sunday evening. You should be able to see my slides. Okay, so the talk that I'm going to be giving tonight is about the changing nature of fire and what that means for California birds, which is particularly the species that I study with respect to fire, but we can probably generalize some of this to birds more broadly in Western conifer forests. And before I start, I really want to recognize several really key collaborators as part of this work. I did my PhD on species shifting their ranges in the Sierra Nevada. And my first postdoc was working with Institute for Bird Populations. I took the postdoc because it was sort of advertised, was on blackback woodpeckers. It sounded cool. I needed a postdoc, and it sounded like a kind of fun idea. But this was a project that really snowballed for me. And even though I finished that work in 2012, I've continued to work very, very closely with IBP ever since. And now as a professor, Institute for Bird Populations is a really integral partner with the work that I do. That work really has been sort of really day to day with Rodney Siegel and Bob Wilkerson, and to a lesser degree, but no less degree, with Jim Sirocco and Peter Pyle. Throughout this, we've also had a lot of support from the Forest Service, particularly through Region 5 and some through individual forests like Plumas County. That work started with Diana Craig, then with Chrissy Howell, now with Sarah Sawyer, and then Matt Johnson in Plumas has been really useful. So even though I'm the keynote speaker tonight, the research that I'm presenting is extremely much a collaborative multi-agency group project. It is a partnership between academia with NGOs and government to understand how species respond to fire in California's forests. Now, before I get into the science, I do want to pause a little bit because I'm talking about fire tonight and its impacts. I'm talking about its impacts on birds, and I'm talking about them both from a negative sense, but also from a positive sense. And I just want to acknowledge that we, particularly those of us who are living in the West right now, which I assume is the majority of the audience, we are very much at this moment living through the impacts of fire. I right now am safe in my home in Los Angeles, but many of you have not been safe either this year or in other times in the recent past. And so fire is something that impacts all of us in a very, very strong way, whether it's worrying about what's going to happen in the middle of the night, from evacuating, from losing actually access. So before I go on to my slides, I just wanted to pause and recognize that. So with that sort of stated, but before I get to the birds, I want to talk a little about fire and its changing impacts here in California. So the actual frequency of fire, at least in California, isn't necessarily changing. So if you consider fires that are sort of a relatively large size, like over 1,000 acres, the number of them per year has not actually changed all that much. For the most part, the number of fires per year is more or less staying relatively constant for the last 35 years or so. What's changing is the total area burned. And so this is just showing data from 1984 through 2016, showing a nice, essentially linear increasing pattern with some variation around that of how much of California is burned each year, averaging around somewhere around 800,000 acres per year. But this is a plot that ends in 2016. Oh, before I get there, in addition to this increasing frequency of the acreage increasing over time, also we know that climate change is making it worse. And so based off of studies of attribution, which is sort of a new realm of climate science that's really been sort of become majorly important over the last 5 to 10 years, we can study essentially how much area of the Western US would burn in a given year without climate change, and then with the added aspect of where we are currently with climate change. And what they're estimating right now is that about the total acreage burning is about double what it would be if we did not have the sort of anthropogenic climate change effect on top of that. So that last slide I showed was through 2016, the trend in area burned. But then 2017 and 2018 were these huge outlier years. They were the worst years ever for fires in California, with over 1.5 million acres burned. 2019 was kind of anomalously low, really low fire year. But then, of course, 2020 happened. Right? So this y-axis, the scale on this graph has now had to change to show where 2020 was. In 2020 in California, we had over 3.5 million acres burned. A lot of that was from that lightning storm that happened in August that led to massive fire complexes, like one of the complexes that burned over 1 million acres. But 2020 was extreme. Well, but what about 2021? Where are we now? 2021, we're almost already beating where we were in 2017 and 2018. We have, right now, as of today, we have burned 1.65 million acres in California. Almost half of that is from a single fire, the Dixie fire, that has burned over 750,000 acres across 4 counties in the Sierra Nevada. And we are on track to possibly tying where we were in 2020, depending on what happens over the rest of the year. So if every year going forward was as bad in California for fires as 2020 was, then every single inch of California would be on schedule to burn every 25 years. Essentially, we could burn the entire state top to bottom every 25 years if we burned as much area as we did in 2020. But of course, that's kind of like a silly thought experiment because we don't burn urban areas, we don't burn beaches, we don't burn agriculture. So if we actually only restricted this to the burnable parts of California, that is essentially the areas with non-grass vegetation, so shrublands, hardwoods, and conifers, then every part of California would burn every 15 years. So we're moving into a potential reality where the fire return interval, that is how frequently a given patch of land on random burns, we're going potentially to a fire return interval of 15 years, which is not like anything that I don't think most ecosystems in California have ever actually experienced. Fire return intervals in California are generally somewhere between 40 to 100 years, depending on what habitat you're talking about. So the takeaway from this is that our fire regime is changing. So what do I mean by fire regime? It's the group of characteristics to describe the nature of fire in a given area. So that could be the severity of fire. I'm going to be showing a bunch of these types of severity maps during this talk. Red is basically every tree is dead. Green means fire has gone through there, but most of the trees are still alive. The fire was contained to the lower stories. So severity changing, the frequency or the fire return interval of an area is changing. The size, the average size of our fires is changing. So we have variation in the size of fires from, say, the 117 hectare salt fire to the 250,000 acre rim fire in 2013, which of course at the time was the largest fire ever to burn in the Sierra Nevada, which of course has been eclipsed several times, including just this year with the Dixie fire that is 3 times the size currently of the rim fire. And the seasonality is another aspect of the fire regimes. We often in California consider we have what we consider a normal fire season, which kind of begins in June and is really quite high in July and August. and then kind of peters out. What we're seeing is actually an extension of the fire season, so that fires are not just starting earlier in the year, like they did this year with drought, but are also extending much later in the year because the return of the rains is being delayed. So our fire regime, in terms of its severity, frequency, size, and seasonality, is all changing. And so the questions that I'm going to be talking about in this lecture today is, how do birds respond? And so we can think of this response in two different ways. First is, how do birds respond during fire? What do they do during fire? What happens to them? And then what also happens to birds after fire? What do burned areas, and particularly burned forested areas in the conifer forests of the western US, what do they look like in the months to years following fire? So during fire, the quick answer is that we don't know all that much. We know that birds die, and I'm sorry if this image is really shocking to you. This is a rainbow lorikeet that is washed ashore amidst lots of ash on the beaches of Australia in the sort of really quite record 2019-2020 summer season, fire season they had in Australia that we've all forgotten about, that happened basically in January 2020. So we can find evidence that birds die in fires. Birds probably do better than many other animals because they can fly away to some extent, but how many actually do, how far they get, and how many actually die in fires is a complete unknown. It is not something we really have a good grasp on. But in addition to the actual fire, there's also smoke. This is actually a photo I took last night as I was flying home from vacation. And I was actually up in Alaska, and we were flying down, and it was beautiful, beautiful. And then we hit California, and all I could see was smoke. And you can see in the middle of this, I guess it's not labeled. In the middle of this is actually a smoke plume that I actually believe is the Dixie Fire. And then the rest of it is just the Central Valley and everything covered in smoke as far as you can see. And of course, I don't know if anyone has been using the New York Times very, very good wildfire and smoke tracking website that they've built. But, for instance, this is this map of smoke today throughout California. And you can see that basically everywhere you are in California, including where we're supposed to be today in Reno, outside of maybe like LA area and the immediate coast, is currently covered in smoke. And so the effects of smoke on birds is also completely unknown. I want to take you back a year ago to something that probably many of you heard about, and some of you actually possibly are studying, which is this mass mortality event of migratory birds that happened in the desert Southwest, primarily in New Mexico in September. There are sort of videos like this of basically dead and dying birds littering. This is like a riverbank. And this is some of the collections from New Mexico State University showing some of the birds that were gathered. And this all happened. There's a lot of hypotheses about what led to this. And one of those hypotheses that still has not entirely been ruled out is that actually it's not the smoke caused asphyxiation of these birds, but the wildfire season in 2020 basically actually caused either the forced migration, the early migration, or the change in migratory movements of a whole suite of birds, primarily aerial insectivores, that then actually led to this kind of bad experience of essentially flying into a cold snap that killed all the insects, and everything kind of died of starvation. But the role of smoke here might not necessarily be direct, it could be indirect. And these are the types of things that we're all trying to study and trying to understand, but are very complex. And the short end of this is that, how do birds respond to fire? I don't know. Active flames and heavy smoke can have negative impacts on bird populations, but it's really hard to study, and we have very little numerical data. And so right now for me, it's a huge, I have no clue. If you're studying this and you have interesting ideas on how to study this, I'd love to hear that. So the rest of my talk is actually going to be on a different topic, which is kind of like, what happens after fire? What happens after these flames are gone, the ash has settled, and essentially we are left with a burned forest? Something that is not covered in flames, but actually that is something that to some extent is coming alive. A year or two later, everything, flowers emerge, grasses emerge, you can hear birds singing. These are very, very different habitats that also vary quite complexly in terms of burn severity and how they regenerate and what kind of post-fire management we do to them. And so these are actually the landscapes that I'm going to be talking about for the rest of this talk, and how birds respond to this post-fire landscape. And one of the real sort of heroes of this story is a bird that I've been studying for the last decade, which is the black-backed woodpecker. These are the species that I'm sure many of you are very familiar with. They are perhaps the most fire-reliant bird species in North America. They, of course, have a range that extends all the way through the Boreal to New England, where they are not really dependent on fire. But in the Western US, particularly in California, given our land management history here, they are very heavily found primarily in recently burned forests. And the reason for this is what they eat. And so as this photo shows, a parent bringing a nice, large, juicy grub to its offspring, this is the larva of wood-boring beetles. These wood-boring beetles, like Cerambicidae, they colonize these trees, these burned and dead and dying trees, within possibly days after they have finished burning. And so in the years that follow of recently burned forest, these beetles, they bore in deep into the wood, they lay their eggs, those eggs hatch, and the larvae then grow to quite large sizes, as you can see in this photo in the upper left, which creates like this massive food source, not just for blackback woodpeckers, but for many of the large diversity of woodpeckers found in California and other parts of the West. And so this food source attracts the blackback woodpeckers in particular, and so they make these forests their home. And so we've been studying blackback woodpeckers in post-fire forests, in addition to other birds, the rest of the bird community, since 2009. And this is work that's really been led by Institute for Bird Populations in collaboration with the Forest Service. And so every year we basically go to 50 different fires throughout the entire range of the Sierra Nevada, from the Oregon border all the way down to the Paiutes. And at this point, we've surveyed in over 133 different fires at over 2,500 survey points. We have over 70,000 detections of 195 different bird species, many of which are also blackback woodpeckers that we're, in addition to doing sort of auditory point counts for, we're also doing broadcast surveys for, so we can monitor them more specifically as well. And part of this is just a trend analysis to say, okay, well, what's the population doing of blackback woodpeckers? And for the most part, we can see that the blackback woodpecker population is doing pretty fine over time. And so this is just a graph through 2016 that's looking at sort of the proportion of occupied fires and the proportion of occupied patches within fires. And in general, about sort of, if you take sort of a random selection of fires that have burned in the last 10 years, somewhere between 60 and 80% of them will have blackback woodpeckers. And then if you sort of pick a random patch, there's probably about a 20% chance that a blackback woodpecker pair is going to be there. So they're actually really quite sort of reliant and easy to find within these fires, and they can be very, very difficult to find elsewhere. But if you actually look not just at trends over time, sort of in aggregate, but if you follow a specific fire, and then as it goes, essentially as it ages, and you look at the number of years since fire for a given patch, then actually you see this really strong decline. And so what happens is that within the first 3 years is really when occupancy of these post-fire forests peak for blackback woodpeckers. That's when the densities are at their highest. And after about 3 to 4 years, you start to see a decline. So again, if you sort of think about entire fires, somewhere around 70 to 80% of them will be occupied by blackback woodpeckers within the first 3 to 4 years. But by 10 years after fire, that's fallen down to about 30%. And the same with that occupancy within fires. If you pick a random patch, like a random spot, and you're like, okay, are there woodpeckers here or not? On average, around 1 or 2 years, that's about 30% of those patches will have pairs. But by 10 years after fire, that's fallen to about 8%. And so we can see this strong temporal trend that is really kind of perplexing. We want to understand why the species is so fire reliant, and in particular, why it's so reliant on really early post-fire forests. And so when we first started to look at this question, we actually really relied on the help of Peter Pyle, who I don't think needs that much of an introduction. But Peter Pyle knows molt limit like no one else does, right? And so Peter we sort of gave him hundreds of photos of spread wings of blackback woodpeckers that we caught. And he basically looked at it and was able to come up with new age classes, extended age classes for blackback woodpeckers based off of their molt and their plumage patternation. And so we basically were able to come up with 5 age class bins for blackback woodpeckers. We have 2nd years, 3rd years, after 3rd years, 4th years, and then after 4th year. Which gives us a lot more resolution to say, to go into a given fire, look at the birds, catch them, and then say, okay, well, how old are you? You know, this is a fire that is 6 years old. How old is the bird? This is a fire that is 1 year old. How old is the bird? And so we did this at 7 different fires in the Sierra Nevada that ranged in their ages from 1 year post-fire to 8 years post-fire. And we caught a total of 57 birds. And we found this kind of interesting pattern, this really intriguing pattern, that essentially, if you went into older fires, you have older birds. So in a fire that is only 1 year old, most of the birds are 2nd years. That is to say, they were born the previous year, and now then the fire happened, and then they suddenly showed up in this fire the following spring. Whereas if you go to an 8-year-old fire, most of the birds are either sort of after 3rd year or after 4th year. And so we looked at this pattern and we said, well, okay, this is weird. Like, this basically is telling us that it's probably juveniles that are actually dispersing into these fires. And then it seems like once they've dispersed into these new fires, then they're probably sedentary for their life. And so that set up a hypothesis that is really what we've been testing for the last 5 years. And we've been testing this really quite thoroughly. And the lead for this is actually this guy who's sort of on the top of this sort of this 6-meter double attached ladder that is basically belayed off in 4 different directions and is not allowed to touch this tree because we can't touch the trees. Because otherwise the trees might fall down. And this man is Andrew Stillman, who is a recent PhD student from my lab. Andrew really sort of spent the last 6 years trying to answer this question about what juvenile woodpeckers are doing, where they're going, why they're going in different places. And he's answered this question in a lot of different amazing ways. And this started with actually nest searching and nest monitoring, which is what we're doing in this photo. And then once right before the woodpeckers are about to fledge, we actually go up and we drill sort of outside, right next to the nest hole. We extract the fledgling woodpeckers that are within a day of leaving their nest. We put radio transmitters on them, and then we track them, right? So they leave their nest, and we spend months and months following their every move, seeing where they go. But eventually we can't sort of track them anymore. Like, they're dispersing, like they're not just going 100 meters. We have to be able to follow them a little bit farther. So then we actually start flying around in planes, flying around the Sierra Nevada, doing circles back and forth across all of our fires and other fires we're not even studying, trying to find these woodpeckers again and to see where they go up to 1 year later. Essentially to say, like, if they leave their nest in, say, July, we want to track them through the following June or so. And so the questions you might having are like, okay, what are the results? Where do they go? And I'm really excited to show this because I actually never showed this to anyone else before. This was just accepted last week at the Journal Behavioral Ecology. So this is brand new, off the presses, not even really out yet. So this is hard to do. So we only have a sample size of 19 woodpeckers that have actually survived long enough for us to be able to figure out where they went. And a portion of them, 7 of these 19, settled in different fires. And so each of these graphs is basically a different individual that we're just showing as an example. In the dark gray are burned fires, or burned patches, or really they're burned fires. Like, the scale here is large. So this is one fire and this is another fire. And the light gray is unburned habitat. It could be grassland, it could be forest. A lot of this is pretty forest. This is in sort of Plumas and Lassen County in California. And the color is basically showing time. And so this basically shows a bird that was hatched in May. We tracked it for a while. We then lost it in the fall. We couldn't find it, but then we found it the following May in its new breeding site where it has essentially dug a nest cavity in a different fire. So it left its natal fire and went to a different fire. This is another example of a bird that spent its fall, for the most part, it's May through its summer into early fall in its natal fire. When in November, we basically found it in a different fire. And then the following spring, we found it breeding in a third fire. We also have birds that basically settled in unburned forests. This is not a species that is strictly found in fire. So we have essentially a bird that left its natal fire and then moved up here into some area. I think this actually happened to be a slightly disturbed site where there'd been some beetle infestation. So there were dead trees, which are a key resource. And on the bottom, we have a bird that basically left its natal fire and then moved around a whole bunch of places until it actually ended up breeding at a site that was quite close to the edge of the fire. So that was 4 out of 19 birds. And then we have the largest selection, which is 8 out of 19 birds, but about the same number as those that settled in different fires that basically settled in their natal fire. And some of these are birds that for the most part, as far as we can tell, never really left their natal fire. And some of them are birds that left their natal fire in the fall and were out exploring the world and then potentially didn't find anything they liked and then returned back to their natal fire to breed the following spring. So, okay. How far did they go is another question. Well, they went varying amounts of degrees. Obviously, if they left their fire, then they went farther. The farthest we tracked a bird was a bird that went 50 kilometers. We lost a lot of birds, meaning we couldn't find them. And we did a lot of experiments. We're pretty sure that we're good at finding birds by air and by car. And so we're actually pretty sure that a fair number of those birds probably went farther than 50 kilometers. It pops well farther than 50 kilometers, but 50 is the farthest we could find. We found strong relationships between the distance they dispersed and the years since fire. So if the fire itself was older, they were more likely to actually go farther. And also nestling mass, which is actually expected with birds in general, which is that heavier birds, that is say fatter birds or birds that are healthier, are more likely to actually travel farther because they have more resources that they can actually potentially make that sort of that journey off into the unknown. Well, sort of what made them sort of leave their natal fire, or what was the likelihood that they had left their natal fire? Well, in general, we found that a decent amount, probably about half or more than half, left their natal fire. But the probability of them doing so almost became 100% for fires that were over 4 years old. So if it had been more than 4 years since the fire occurred, which we told you was that kind of drop-off point, then basically there's no more settling back in your natal fire and all of those birds dispersed to other habitats. And then finally, sort of what actually happens in terms of where they go. So in total, about 78% of the woodpeckers settled in burned forest. The random expectation based on the availability of burned habitat versus other actual forested habitat in the area is that at random, we'd expect only about 10% of birds to settle into burned forest. And so the fact that 78% of our tracked woodpeckers did settle for breeding in burned forest is a very strong effect that these birds are traveling through the landscape, sampling habitats, and preferentially selecting burned forest. And in particular, we found that birds that left one fire and moved to another fire, which is a small sample, but if you look at only those birds that left one fire and moved to another fire, they pretty much all moved to fires that were younger. So this is showing essentially these lines are connecting individual birds, showing the age of the fire that they were born in versus the age of the fire they left. And there's only really one bird that radically increased the age. So this is a bird that was born in a 5-year-old fire and ended up settling in a 10-year-old fire. For the most part, all the other birds that we saw either moved to a fire that was younger or was the same age. So there's something obviously really important about fire and really sort of important to the species. But one of the questions we had is thinking about this, and as we think about what this means for conservation and management, is like, well, is it just fire or is it just dead trees? And so there's more than one way to kill a tree in Sierra Nevada. Another major way is drought. So we had basically this huge sort of natural experiment in 2014 through 2017 of a major, really heavy, terrible drought, potentially about the same type of thing that we're entering in again right now. But we're talking about here the drought that began in 2014 and really ended in 2017. And this drought not just weakened a lot of trees, but it led to an invasion not of wood-boring beetles that I've talked about earlier, but a different type of beetle, the bark beetle. And these bark beetles, for the most part, have kind of always been around in California a little bit, but have never really cataclysmically affected California's forests. But when they did in 2014 through 2017, they really came in a heavy way. This is an article that was actually sort of an image that was accompanied an article in Mother Jones magazine that was about the invasion of the bark beetles. That was kind of these monsters that were marching over from Colorado to attack and kill California's forests. And it caused major, major damage. This is an example of what that bark beetle infestation looks like. You have these large, extensive, homogeneous patches of trees that are all dying simultaneously. And eventually they will lose all their needles. Here they're all red, as it's kind of early on, but eventually they'll lose all their needles and they will look essentially like snags. And that in California, particularly in the southern Sierra Nevada, starting from kind of south of Tahoe all the way down through the Sequoia, was really, really heavily hit with large concentrations of these dead patches of trees. But when you actually compare essentially these beetle-killed trees to fire-killed trees, you see a lot of similarities. And maybe before I put these images up, you didn't know actually which of these was which, but it's beetle on the top and fire on the bottom. And so we could say, okay, dead trees are dead trees. Maybe this habitat that's being created by drought is also really good for blackback woodpeckers. And so the question then is, are all snags created equal? And so we went about this. We already were doing our surveys in fire-killed stands for blackback woodpeckers throughout 2016 through 2018. But we supplemented our surveys at that time by looking at another 113 different stands of trees across California's Sierras, where we looked at areas that were killed by beetles, not by fire. And in these 113 stands, we did a whole bunch of bird surveys, including specific surveys for blackback woodpeckers. And so then we could compare during these same set of years, well, where did we find woodpeckers in fire-killed forests, and where did we find woodpeckers in beetle-killed forest? We looked at a lot of different effects that really kind of varied in sort of whether or not they were significant or not. Basically, everything that is actually here is a significant effect, unless it's a period. And the plus or minus shows sort of the direction. So in both fire-killed forest and beetle-killed forest, the more snags you had, the more woodpeckers you had. In terms of years since disturbance, we find that with fire, there is this negative effect. So the longer it's been since the fire, the less woodpeckers you have. We didn't find a temporal effect with beetles. We find more woodpeckers at higher elevations and more woodpeckers at higher latitudes. But overall, the most important thing was actually this disturbance type, where you have fewer woodpeckers and lower woodpecker occupancy in areas where it's beetle-killed forest rather than fire-killed forest. And the sort of the dumb takeaway of this is just to look at the average occupancy rates of blackback woodpeckers in burned forests. It's 10.4%, and in beetle-killed forests, it's 1.1%. The odds of a blackback woodpecker occurring in a fire-killed forest are over 12 times higher than the odds of a blackback woodpecker occurring in a beetle-killed forest. So it's clearly not just dead wood. It's not just the availability of dead wood. There's something else that is special about fire in terms of what it does and how it creates habitat and food resources for blackback woodpeckers and potentially other birds. So why is this? Where does this relationship come from? And the answer, as best we know, is grounded in ecological theory, which is the concept that diversity begets biodiversity. And we can go back to MacArthur in 1961, looking at how bird diversity in different areas that they'd gone and studied, different habitats and different environments, how bird diversity scaled with foliage diversity as this measure of structural diversity of habitats. And they found this really strong linear relationship that as you have a habitat with more structure, you have more bird species. This is essentially the idea of sort of niche differentiation, resource partitioning, and sort of, if you're interested in community ecology, the idea of environmental filtering leading to bird diversity or diversity in general. At the same time, another thing that fire can another view or lens for viewing fire sort of ecology theory is the intermediate disturbance hypothesis that goes back to Connell in 1978, which says that if we have fire, if we have essentially a habitat or an ecosystem that has disturbance, well, if the disturbance is too frequent, then essentially we have low diversity. And if the disturbance is too infrequent, it's too rare, then we also don't have super high diversity. But if you have somewhere in between where you have this mixed type of environment of disturbance, then that is potentially where you're going to have the greatest amount of diversity. So these two ideas together have come to inform sort of this notion, this ecological notion of biodiversity in fires that is given the name of pyrodiversity. And so pyrodiversity is a way of describing a fire or an ecosystem that contains fire. And pyrodiversity is the temporal or structural diversity of fire. And I like to sort of show it at the fire scale with this example from the Rim Fire, which burned in the Sierra Nevada in 2013. And so this map, this image here shows essentially the temporal day-by-day progression and expansion of the Rim Fire. So it began on August 17th, 2013 at this little dark pink nodule here. It sort of expanded rapidly to the south on the 19th, but then the winds changed. And then on the 21st, it had this huge, massive expansion. And so this is the type of thing that we are seeing that are now defining the behavior of megafires, including things like the Dixie Fire and the Bootleg Fire, that you have these days where fuel and weather combine to create massive expansions. And this temporal sort of burning pattern leads directly to the post-fire habitat. So this is a false color or NDVI image of the fire, of the fire burn scar after it occurred, which we can then translate to burn severity. And so this map, as I showed you before, is actually 4 colors, although it's hard to see the yellow and the red, or is it the yellow and the orange? But the green are areas where fire has burned, but you have less than 25% basal area loss of trees. That is to say, less than 25% of the trees are dead. And the red are these areas where you have over 75 to 100% of the trees are dead. And you can see that this pattern is not a topographical pattern. Obviously, topography matters and obviously fuel matters, but a lot of this is based off of the actual expansion. So the fact that all of this burned so heavily that day meant that that fire was burning super hot. It was fueled by weather and it just blasted through everything, leading to this huge, expansive, homogeneous patch of high severity fire. And so we can think and look at this patchwork or mosaic of different burn severities within fires. And we can talk about the pyrodiversity within a fire in terms of the structural diversity of fire, but then we can also look at it across fires. We have variations. We have some fires where you have a lot of this variation, like these fires on the top, and you have some fires where you have much less variation, where the patches are bigger and the fire itself is more homogeneous within. And so in that case, we have those. In this case, the fires on the top are high pyrodiversity, the fires on the bottom are low pyrodiversity. And within fires, we can also look at individual patches and classify them as low pyrodiversity, like this one is mostly all green, this one's mostly all red, or high pyrodiversity, meaning this one is a mix of green and red, meaning you have a strong mixture of multiple burn severities, or similar to this patchwork. And so we can test this by biodiversity hypothesis by looking at spatial variation in pyrodiversity within fires and looking at how bird diversity differs across those. We can do that within individual fires or entire fires. We could also talk about, and I don't want to get into it all that much, we could also talk about temporal pyrodiversity, which is another aspect of diversity, which is actually looking at multiple overlapping fires and fire return intervals and the structure of those and how those impact diversity. So there's, if you're into the whole pyrodiversity thing, there's these 2 different methods of looking at it. We wanted to look at this particular question. So we went back to our surveys and we found this actual pretty strong relationship between species richness at the fire level and pyrodiversity, which is an index. Don't care about the units. This is low, this is high. And at 1 year after fire, the first year after the fire occurred, this relationship is pretty flat. There's not really a relationship there. 1 year after a fire, low pyrodiversity, higher pyrodiversity, they all have approximately the same amount of bird species. But by 10 years after fire, this relationship has really strengthened. By 10 years after fire, the number of bird species is about double what it is in a pyrodiverse area as what it is in a low pyrodiversity fire. And so why is this? Well, part of this is because you have really strong dissimilarity of communities over time and based on burden severity. So if you go walking in a fire, the bird communities that you find in a high severity fire patch is very different from the bird communities you find in a low severity patch. And that what that characteristic community is changes over time. And so this graph is actually slightly easier to understand, which is showing the dissimilarity of these different burn severities 1 year after fire versus 9 years after fire. And you can see that 1 year after fire, basically unburned forest bird communities are equally dissimilar to low severity fire communities as compared to medium severity fire communities as compared to high severity fire communities. They're all basically about the kind of this more or less the same community. But by 9 years after fire, these communities have really started to diverge, and they're diverging and splitting off based on that severity. So the high severity fires 9 or 10 years after fire are very different than the unburned and low severity fires. And this makes sense partly because different traits are structuring those bird communities during those times. And so, for instance, cavity nesters have their own temporal trajectory where they are early colonizers after fire, and then they actually they create nests for other species, secondary cavity nesters that aren't there immediately, but do show up 2 to 3 to 5 years after fire. And things like canopy nesters have their own type of structure. Some of them might actually stick around the first year or two following fire and then totally disappear because there's not really that much habitat for them left. So the takeaway from this is that, well, okay, we have these different biodiversities, and our different sort of habitat, the different burn severities themselves have different characteristic in avifaunas. So like a low severity burn patch might have canopy nesters like western tanagers, where a high severity burn forest might have a cavity nester like a Lewis's woodpecker. But in high biodiversity areas, you have this habitat complementarity, you have resource partitioning, which leads to both of these species being able to cohabitate in those areas because you essentially have more different diverse types of habitat structure available. This is an understanding for why biodiversity leads to biodiversity that I think should be relatively intuitive to most of you. But the last little thing I want to talk about is, well, like, what about this really weird species, this blackback woodpecker, that has this really, really strong relationships? Do blackback woodpeckers also care about biodiversity? Does any individual species care about biodiversity? Or is biodiversity just a phenomenon, or the biodiversity effect, is that just a phenomenon that we get in aggregate because of things like environmental filtering and resource partitioning? And so going back to our blackback woodpecker study, we've done a lot of nest monitoring. And between 2011 and 2018, we monitored over 118 nests. And we looked at, well, okay, what are the characteristics that determine where blackback woodpeckers are building their nests? And we found that a lot of different things matter. We found that that they preferentially build their nests in areas with high burn severity and high snag density with medium tree diameters. Like they build their nests lower on the tree than you'd expect at random. And most of those cavities are orienting east. That's all interesting. But the thing I want to show you and I want to talk about is this distance to edge, and that they're also more likely to build their nests in dead trees if that dead tree is close to either the edge of the fire scar or the closest patch of unburned forest. And so we can actually sort of show this, that the relative probability of nest placement declines quite rapidly with distance to low severity or unburned edges. And so after you're more than 500 meters from a sort of a low severity or unburned habitat, basically you're not going to find any blackback woodpecker nests. And when we found this, it was actually like quite surprising for us, because this species has been sort of thought of as sort of only requiring dense stands of burned forests, of dense stands of dead trees. And as long as you had dense stands of dead trees, it didn't matter where those dead trees were, the blackback woodpeckers would find it. And what we are finding here is that actually, that it's not just any stand of dead trees, it's actually these dead trees that are closest to the edges. But that wasn't where we ended. That was just with nest placement. What about actually how the individual birds are using their habitat, whether it's adults or juveniles? And so for this, we did our radio tracking and our telemetry work of both adults and juveniles. And what we found is that juveniles and adults have radically different habitat needs and radically different ways that they use the environment. And so these graphs, the dark red is high severity and the gray is low severity, but it's all burned area. And the black dots are individual tracking records from a single individual. This is just kind of exemplary. So this is a fledgling, and these are the individual tracks during all of the summer and fall that we tracked it. And this is for an adult in a slightly different area. It's not its parent, but this is for an adult. And you can see that they're using different areas. The juveniles, the fledglings, are all using primarily low severity or sometimes medium severity habitats. And the adults are primarily using high severity areas. The other thing you should notice is that they're using edges. The fledglings are using the edges of the low severity, and the adult is using the edge of the high severity. This adult is using this entire area, but it's not using these middle, big, dense, high severity, dense stands. It's sticking around to the edges. And so when we actually look at the sort of measure the biodiversity of the areas in which they're using, measured as the spatial heterogeneity and burden severity, we find that both fledgling black-eyed woodpeckers and adults both have this positive relationship of their relative probability of use to this measure of biodiversity. And why? You might be like, why? What is going on? The answer is survival. So we track these juvenile woodpeckers for, well, as long as we could, really up to 1 year. But particularly if we look at essentially the first month of life, the first 35 days after they leave the nest. You have a positive relationship between survival and the biodiversity of the areas that they use. And this primarily comes from differential survival between spending time in high severity burn forest versus any other type of habitat. And if these juvenile woodpeckers spent significant time in high severity burn forest, their 35-day survival was radically lower. And the reason for this is predation. So this is actually a photo that was taken inside a nest where we found a transmitter from one of our juvenile blackback woodpeckers. And I would never have guessed that Western screech owls predated on a woodpecker that's basically the same size as it, but this is where we found one of those transmitters. We also found transmitters in the nests of northern goshawks, of red-tailed hawks, of great horned owl. You find them in pretty much any predator, avian predator nest that you can name in this area. And so what we have here is this idea actually of essentially a landscape of fear. That landscape of fear is actually influencing this biodiversity relationship within a single species. Because the predation pressure on these juvenile woodpeckers that are dependent on food from their parents is so strong that the juvenile woodpeckers basically leave their nest and go quickly as possible to the nearest habitat of essentially trees with needles on them, of living trees, which is usually low severity or unburned habitat. They get there and they stick there as long as they can, begging and screaming more or less when they're hungry, and their parents stay nearby, which is why their parents are staying around to those edges too. And their parents stay nearby, gathering food, and then traveling from the high severity forest where they have better survival because they have some, wits to them, to the unburned forest, feed their juveniles, and then they go back. And they travel, it's been essentially a parent offspring on two sides of these edges until essentially the juveniles reach independence and go off and to find to make their way in the world. But so this habitat, this differential survival effect across habitats, really structured by the landscape of fear, is actually really strongly impacting the space use in the ecology of this species, which has sort of radically changed our view of how we do management and how we do conservation for the species, because it's not just necessarily do we need patches of high severity forest with lots of dead trees, but we actually need them intermixed with patches of low severity and unburned forest, that is to say in biodiverse areas that are also good for bird diversity in a larger sense. So from what we found in our work, we have evidence for these two different types of mechanisms underlying a biodiversity relationship. The first is what I consider kind of a boring thing, which is resource partitioning, which is like different birds have different needs. And if you combine those multiple habitats together, you're going to get more. Okay, we understand that. But the second is this landscape of fear thing, which I think is super cool, that basically predation can change behaviors across age classes, leading to differential survival, which can structure the habitat uses of both the juveniles and their parents, and therefore the species as a whole. That's really cool in my view. But what it means is it doesn't mean that more fire in California or the West is generally a good thing. we are talking about, the theme throughout this entire talk is that we are living through this new age of megafires. We are like right now, the Dixie Fire is, this massive megafire that is still burning in mostly Plumas and Lassen and into other counties. And the problem with these megafires, as I showed you with that rim example, is that they don't have high power diversity. They have large, huge, expansive patches that burn frequently in these high weather-driven conditions that are generally creating vast blasted sections of high severity fire. And that's not just bad for bird diversity writ large, it's even bad for these fire-loving forest birds like the black-backed woodpecker. And so because our fire regime is changing, it means that, I don't really know what the future of bird diversity in California forests are, but what I can tell you is that it's probably not good. Unless we can solve and reduce, or at least restrict, the future climate change, and actually try and do some forest management that will lead to healthier forests and essentially mitigate the occurrence or the destruction caused by these large megafires, it's just not going to be good for the diversity of our forests in California or likely other parts of the West. So with that, I'm happy to take questions. I just want to thank you, both funding from a variety of sources. The data provided here was not just heavily from Andrew Stillman's PhD work in my lab, but also hundreds of field workers working on black-backed woodpeckers and other species since 2009. Obviously, thanks to WFO for having me here for this keynote, and to my collaborators at IBP and the Forest Service. So with that, I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. That's very interesting. The first question comes from Don Dunn, and he says, how does salvage logging affect occupation by black-backed woodpeckers?
Yeah, so there haven't been, there's been a few studies in salvage logging. Obviously, if you take out resources, right, we know that those dead trees are a resource to the black-backed woodpeckers. You take out some dead trees and the habitat is not going to be as good for black-backed woodpeckers. That's not particularly surprising. At the same time, we've done studies looking at this. We have, we've gone to a fire 1 year after fire, and we've gone back the next year, and there's been salvage logging in between. You go back to these salvage logging areas, and often, sometimes you still actually find woodpeckers there. In some cases, you find more woodpeckers. There's obviously salvage logging is there's a degree. We think of salvage logging as being this monolithic thing, but obviously can vary from taking out a handful of trees to clear cutting. If you clear cut, you're going to lose all the woodpeckers. If you're going to take out a handful of trees, I think it's going to really matter what and when. What we try and, when we are working with the Forest Service in areas where we are doing our studies, we obviously are trying to get them to do any type of post-fire forest management, not during the nesting season. So sort of to minimize disturbance. But yeah, I think I'll end it there.
Okay. We have another question. Black-backed woodpeckers in the east seem on occasion to travel farther, at least when looking at vagrancy. For example, Pennsylvania, even Cape May, New Jersey. Also, why no black-backed woodpeckers over most of Wyoming and none in Utah or Colorado? Maybe are the breaks of no forest too large?
They are in Colorado, aren't they? I think they're in Colorado, John. Or am I wrong about that? I know they get into the Black Hills of South Dakota, as I've seen them there. Yeah, I mean, they have a weird distribution, and they have a distribution that changes. There's a scientist in Canada, Junior Tremblay, who studies black-backed woodpeckers in Quebec primarily. And he and I get into arguments all the time about what the species needs, because it seems like two species. Genetically, it's not. I mean, the genetic work still needs to be done again, probably, but there's one study out there that did genetic work. California and Oregon could be a distinct population segment, but it's definitely one species. But its ecology changes really rapidly. And I think you're right that there is this thing about dispersal that could be greater on the East Coast you hear stories of like huge vagrants of blackback woodpeckers that have shown up in Massachusetts, possibly from originating in the White Mountains of New Hampshire or something like that. Whereas you don't hear about them like here showing up in the San Gabriels, for instance, as far as I know. But, you know, as I said, the farthest we found them traveling was about 50 kilometers, but our good guess is that probably about 25% of them were actually traveling at least that far, if not farther, in their juvenile dispersal.
Kurt Leuschner asks, by the time a stand of trees is completely dead from bark beetles, are the beetles still there for the woodpeckers to eat, or are they long gone?
So once the stand is completely dead, they're definitely still blackback. There's definitely still wood-boring beetle larvae available. So if you think about like a fire burning through an area, it actually can probably kill some of those trees quite immediately in the fire. And it's actually the dead wood that the larvae are feeding on. Now that tree starts to deteriorate over time. It's not just the larvae that are eating away at it. There's fungus and bacteria and all sorts of stuff that is essentially decomposing the tree. And so at some point, actually, the tree itself also it is decomposed enough, and it might still be standing, that it's not good for those wood-boring beetles. So you do see kind of this tempering over time, where immediately after fire, you have sort of lots of colonization of wood-boring beetles. That's possibly also due to chemosensing, that some of the species of wood-boring beetles actually smell smoke and will travel long distances to actually lay their eggs in recently burned forests. But then what also will happen is that you have these trees that for the most part sort of kind of deteriorate and so they don't really, it's kind of this one-shot deal within the first few years after a tree dies.
All right. Lori asks, regarding the increasing trends in severity and area burned, how much of that is caused by increasing human-caused ignitions, especially ignitions during dry or windy conditions when lightning-caused ignitions are less likely?
Oh, Lori, that's a great question. I haven't studied that myself, but I know Leroy Westerling, who is at Merced, has looked at that. And my memory, and I don't think Leroy's here because he's not a bird guy, so I hope I'm not misremembering. My memory is that it's not just human-caused ignitions. That's my memory of the takeaway. If you actually look at, it's hard to, not all fires get a very, for sure, causal attached to them. But my memory is that the huge increase in fires in an area burned is not necessarily coming from human-caused ignitions.
All right. I think we've got time for just a couple more. Helen asks, were you able to see a difference in blackback woodpecker predators, say that 3 times fast, between high and low severity fire areas?
Hey, Helen, IBP employee, Helen Laughlin, bee queen, also does great stuff with willow flycatchers. So we haven't looked at that. That's an interesting question. My guess is that we would see more cavity nesting predators in high severity areas and more like forest, like things like goshawks and stuff. But those goshawks, like all those birds, travel really long distances. And so I don't know if you'd any, the sample size of actually are no. We find lots of dead blackback woodpeckers, like lots of dead babies, lots of bloody transmitters. I don't want to get too gory. We don't often know who the predator is. We only know who the predator is in this handful of occasions where they actually take the whole thing back to a nest. Usually the predators are just kind of actually just chewing up the bird right there and then, and they take the transmitter and they just throw it onto the ground as if it were a bone. So I'm sorry. Okay, so that's grisly. I know it's a Sunday night.
Christy asks, how best should post-fire succession habitats be managed to maintain species richness and fire resilience? Would it need human intervention or thinning?
Whew, okay, I could give another lecture on that, Christy, and I think many other people could too. I don't have all the answers on that. I do believe that through a combination of how we've managed our forests for industry over the last century and how we've managed our forests for fire suppression over the last century means that the forests, at least the conifer forests in California, are not particularly resilient to fire right now. And so that part of the mega fires we're getting, obviously it is being driven by weather and it's being driven by drought, but essentially the structure of the forest right now are not helping things. So I am on the side that more smart human intervention, particularly as much as we can prescribed fire, will be necessary to actually create forests that are both resilient to fire and forests that are resistant to fire.
There were a few questions that we don't have time for, but where can people go for more information? Can they contact you directly?
Absolutely. My website is super easy to remember. It is myname.com. So morgantingley.com. My email is on there. It's also, my email is my first initial and last name, mtingley@ucla.edu. And I think I probably talked about research from 10 to 15 different papers in this talk. And so if you want any of that research, you can't find it or you don't have access to it, definitely, obviously, please email me. And I'm happy to give information to anyone who asks for it.
All right, thank you so much. I'm going to bring John Harris back in, and we will wrap things up.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Morgan.
Thank you, Morgan. That was a fascinating presentation and one of great relevance. I'm sure you'll have some people contacting you for more information. Before I sign off, I'd like to thank the members for your attendance and support of WFO and your feedback during the conference. I'd like to thank Jen Hodge for her essential support in producing the conference and in helping speakers and attendees throughout the event. I'd like to thank Steve Rottenborn for organizing and conducting the science sessions, and the steering committee for help in setting up and designing the conference. The steering committee included, besides Jen and Steve, Ed Pandolfino, John Dunn, Suzanne Kuroda, Kurt Leuschner, Homer Hansen, and Kimball Garrett. And I think I've gotten everybody. So thank you again, everyone, and hope to see you all out birding. Good night.